Can we go down to the second page? Yeah.
Right.
Actually, go back to the first page for a second.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so we're going to resume. I'm going to do a bulk of the lecturing today and complete some of the chronology that we've discussed previously, but add some additional material. The areas that I'm going to focus on are from the time the Maud Committee in Britain came to the conclusion that atomic physics could be used in military applications, and it could be a bomb that could be dropped by an airplane, right up through into the 50s, with four topics that are not on my chronology. I'll put on the board, but you can't see them. One is just the discussion about targets for the bombing, alternative targets. Some of you may know a lot about this. One is about a very important National Security Act that was passed in Congress in 1947, which set up the whole post-war apparatus for U.S. national security, which we still have to this day. The third is the Soviet role and espionage and the Rosenberg trials. And the fourth is the Oppenheimer hearings. These are all amazing developments. How many of you are familiar with what I just said? And how many of you are? Okay, so please comment, question, criticize, whatever. So going back,
Which slide do you want?
the previous one. Yeah. So Frisch and Perls had noted that U-235 was a fissile isotope of uranium, and the nucleus could be bombarded with a neutron, could release vast amounts of energy, and this had military applications. This was written up in a secret memo that went right up to the Prime Minister. This was British only. U.S. did not have knowledge of this at the time, although it quickly gained knowledge. The more, this is actually slightly misleading what I've written. It turned out the committee was named by Niels Bohr, and Niels Bohr's children's nanny was named Maud. So it remains to this day a bit of a mystery why the committee is called the Maud Committee. Later on, people gave it this acronym, the definition of the acronym, military application of uranium detonation, but others said no, it just was Bohr's nanny. In any event, this was the committee that got that insight from Frisch and Perls to the hierarchy of the British government. And then the Americans were informed about this. Now, we've already discussed the fact that there was this letter to Roosevelt about taking this kind of work very seriously. That happened in 1939. And Roosevelt was pondering what to do about this. Remember, the U.S. was still neutral until Pearl Harbor. And in 1940-41, a member of the Maud Committee, who ironically was not British, but he was Australian, Mark Oliphant, a very distinguished Australian physicist, came to the U.S. with the permission of the British government to explain to the Americans the military application of atomic weapons, and furthermore, that the British themselves would not be able to take the lead on this, that they didn't have the resources, economic resources or human resources, and that they were being bombed by the Germans, and it wasn't so obvious that they would have a spot to do this that would be safe. And therefore, Oliphant was charged by the British government with seeking to enlist the Americans to take over the development of an atomic bomb program. And Oliphant first went to a man named Lyman Briggs, who was the chair of a committee called the Iranian Committee. There was a committee looking at the military applications of uranium. But Briggs was completely unimpressed with what Oliphant had to say, and Oliphant gave him a piece of paper, he put it in a drawer and never showed it to anybody. So Oliphant was sort of ballistic about this, and he started to rummage around to see who else could he brief. And he did brief Vannevar Bush, who was Roosevelt's science advisor. And he also met with Fermi, who by that time was at University of Chicago. And he came out here and spoke to Lawrence. And those three, Bush, Fermi, and Lawrence, were totally amenable to understanding the importance of what Oliphant had to say. So then in October 1941, Roosevelt decided to intensify bomb research. This was greatly accelerated after Pearl Harbor in December 41. And in 42, they began to scramble to set up, I don't even want to shut the door, set up an apparatus to get the bomb program going. And that became the Manhattan District Project. The man who was selected to run the Manhattan District Project was an Army officer who had been in charge of developing and building the Pentagon, which became the largest office building in the world. So they said, you're gonna need a guy who can, keep track of a million different things. This is gonna be a complicated project. He had a technical background from MIT, but not in physics. So Leslie Groves became the chair of the Manhattan District Project. And his first job was to select the scientific lead for the project. And what most people told him was the obvious person was Lawrence from Berkeley, who had built the cyclotron, who had won a Nobel Prize, who was maybe the preeminent experimental physicist in the United States, who knew everybody, who was a good guy, who was a Midwesterner, who was normal, who was not strange, good interpersonal skills, perfect. So Groves came out to Berkeley to interview Lawrence and probably offer him the job. But in the course of his time at Berkeley, he met Oppenheimer. And Oppenheimer was not normal, very strange, very eccentric, but hyper smart. And we went over Oppenheimer's background last time. He came from an affluent Jewish family in New York. He studied at Göttingen in Germany after Harvard. He came out at Lawrence's request to help build the theory division of the physics department at Berkeley. And he'd never run anything. The largest activity was a graduate seminar, 15 students. But Groves felt that the knowledge that it would take to make this work involved chemistry, physics, metallurgy, ballistics, and yet with any subject Groves raised with Oppenheimer, he was an encyclopedia. He just knew an extraordinary amount about any topic, as well as Sanskrit and other things that Groves could discuss with him. And Groves was just, pardon the expression, blown away by Oppenheimer's unique intelligence. So even though Oppenheimer didn't fit at all as qualified in terms of having the organizational experience to run something like this, Groves returned to Washington and recommended that Oppenheimer be selected as head of the Manhattan, as head of scientific lead for the Manhattan Project, not Lawrence. So this was a big leap, and could have gone badly. And actually, when Oppenheimer was selected, he was asked. They had to find a place. I'll tell you about the location in a second. He was asked, how many people would need to be involved in this, and he said he thought about 6 scientists and 2 secretaries. That ought to do it. The Manhattan Project had 130,000 people at 30 sites by the end. He was slightly off. I mean, he was clueless about how to run something like this. And he had a very bad first 6 months. He was not able to motivate people, to organize people. And there was concern that this thing was not going to work with Oppenheimer. Now, on the location, one thing that Oppenheimer had done with his parents, he had visited the mountains in northern New Mexico and fell in love with them. Pristine and beautiful areas. So he suggested to Groves that they look around in that area to build a secret site to do the work. It was in the middle of nowhere, and this became Los Alamos. Very quickly, a lot of top flight people were recruited to Los Alamos to work on the project. Now, it's hard to imagine today having literally hundreds of people go to one site without it leaking out. And yet there were no leaks. Turns out, as I'll tell you later, some other people knew about it, but they were not the people who might have leaked. They were not Americans. Slowly but surely, Oppenheimer was able to attract the best minds in physics related to this work, including Server, who was his student. Carl mentioned Server. From Berkeley, Hans Bethe, George Kostikowski, an eminent chemist from Harvard, Edward Teller, Wigner, just an all-star lineup, just amazing people. And what people said, in fact, I. Rabbi, eminent physicist from Columbia who was there, said, there are all these hyper smart people, and then there was Oppenheimer. He said, you couldn't believe how smart Oppenheimer was. He was just unique among all these people about grasping the technical details and integrating the ideas across disciplines. So 2 aspects of the problem were obviously to generate the fissile material needed for the bomb, and through their work and through work that had been done before, they realized, of course, that uranium-235 was a major source, and they selected the Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Tennessee to essentially accumulate fissile material through that activity. And then the other was plutonium-239, which was from reactors. And this was done at primarily at the Hanford, Washington State facility with huge reactors up there. So they had 2 sources for fissile material, one in Tennessee, one in Washington State. There are many other issues about the bomb design. Carl mentioned there were huge fights and arguments about, everything they were doing was new, and there was no answer in the back of the book. That one was a gun type design, a pretty straightforward design using uranium, and one was an implosion device using plutonium. As Carl mentioned last time, the leading scientists there were quite convinced they understood every aspect of the gun-type bomb, so much so that they didn't have to test it, which is still kind of crazy. I mean, you know, maybe I'm originally an engineer. I like to see it work before I believe it. But they weren't. They didn't think it was necessary. But the plutonium device, they thought needed testing. So this then ultimately led in, move on to the second, to the first test of a nuclear device, July 16, 1945. This was at Alamogordo, New Mexico, not far from Los Alamos. The Trinity test, this is an implosion design plutonium device with 20 or maybe 22 KT yield. And it worked, and it was astonishing for them to see. And you know, they thought they had unlocked some source of energy that was profound and dangerous and extremely important. July 16, 1945, this isn't on the chronology, was during the time at which Roosevelt had died, Truman was president, and there was a summit meeting at Potsdam in Eastern Germany. Germany had surrendered May 8, 1945. This was July 16, 1945. And Truman had been informed, by the way, it's interesting, Truman had been vice president under Roosevelt. He died, Roosevelt died April 15, 1945. And until he died, Truman, as vice president, had not been informed about this project. The vice president knew nothing about the atomic bomb project. Secretary of War Stimson knew about it, some other key people knew about it, but not the vice president. Truman was a kind of simple guy. He was a failed haberdasher, hat salesman from Kansas City. But he knew, you know, he had been in the First World War, he had been an Army corporal in the First World War. He knew having important military weapons making a big difference, so he was fully supportive of the idea. But when he went to Potsdam for his very first summit meeting, first time he met Stalin, and he was supposed to meet Churchill, but Churchill actually was defeated in an election right at that time. So ironic. I mean, Churchill, who had really carried Britain through the war and was an amazing leader, the British people felt he was great for the war, but as far as Britain was concerned, the war was over, and they didn't want to have a big hawk to lead the rebuilding of Britain. So Clement Attlee, the Labour leader, was at Potsdam, not Churchill. So Churchill met with Stalin and Attlee. Attlee was aware of the bomb project because the British were participating in the project. Truman asked many of his aides who were there at Potsdam to work through different options as to what to tell Stalin about the project if the test at Alamogordo was successful, which was in the middle of the Potsdam meeting. And they came up with different ideas. And then Truman got, I guess, a telegram that it had worked. The bomb had worked at Alamogordo, July 16th. So Truman made some brief general statement to Stalin on the side that they had an incredibly new weapon that could possibly end the war, because even though Germany had been defeated, Japan still was a belligerent in the war. And they had these options. What would Stalin say? And if Stalin said this, he should say that. And if Stalin said this, he should say that. And all Stalin said was, good, use it, which was none of the options that Truman's staff had developed. So Truman was sort of agape. He didn't say anything, he didn't know what to say. So that's the first official time that Stalin is informed about the project. What Truman and none of the Americans, none of them knew was that Stalin knew about the project and was fully informed about it, which we'll discuss in a little bit. So now we get into, and this had already been done earlier in the year, the debate about what are you going to do with these bombs? How many will you have and what would you do with them? And by early August of 45, just a few weeks later, Truman was informed that the US would have 2 deliverable bombs that would be dropped by aircraft, 2. And then it would take a few more months to have more of them. There were 4 Japanese cities identified as possible targets. That's my first item here, alternative targets. They were Kyoto, 1, Hiroshima, 2, Kokura, 3, and Nagasaki, 4. These were reviewed many times, and Secretary of War Stimson asserted that Kyoto was inappropriate to be attacked because it was a sacred city for the Japanese. It had many vitally important temples and other religious facilities. It didn't have enormous military significance, and it was not the right target for the bomb. So that elevated Hiroshima, which had major military facilities, to the #1 target. And the second target was Kokura. Japan has 4 islands, it's many islands, but 4 main islands. The 3 main islands are Hokkaido in the north, Honshu in the middle, which has Tokyo, and Kyushu in the south. And Kokura is a city in the northernmost part of Kyushu, which is just across the Straits of Shimonoseki from Honshu. It's the northernmost part of the southern island. One of the aircraft, they took off from islands in the Pacific, went to Hiroshima, and dropped the bomb. And these numbers are kind of rough, but this was August 6, 1945. Truman had already offered several times to the Japanese the demand for their unconditional surrender, or there would be a devastating consequence. There was no explicit statement of what would happen. And of course, Truman's decision to drop these bombs remains a major ethical, strategic, even religious issue. Did he have the right to incinerate all these people? Truman himself was evidently not bothered or perplexed by this. Truman was briefed on what they were going to do, knew that it would be devastating, had some buttermilk, and went to bed. And said, we're fighting a war. My job is to end the war as quickly as possible. 250,000 Americans had already been killed. If I can end it a day earlier and save American lives, I'm going to do it. Yes.
Can we expand the ethical debate to talk about how the incorporation of trying to invade and retain islands as we tried to invade them would have cost possibly many of their people, because they had a national militia that they were creating from civilians?
That's right. In the discussions, what if we don't use the bombs? Since the Japanese were not interested in surrender, well, one thing you could do was you could relax the condition of unconditional surrender, but the American leadership was not interested in that. They wanted them to just stop with their hands up, just give up.
We accepted a non-conditional. We accepted a surrender that was not unconditional.
Well, we did, because the emperor was allowed to be retained.
Playing the ethical debate. Oppenheimer's suggestion was to detonate the bomb. And we did warn the Japanese that we had a new weapon. And I think the quote was of,
Enormous.
the likes of which had never been seen.
Right.
We warned them.
Right.
But the Oppenheimer suggestion was to detonate the bomb and tell them what it was.
Yes. Well, there were other alternatives like a demonstration device. But they were rejected by Truman and the leadership. Yes.
Do you know why they were rejected?
Well, some of the military leaders said, if we were in the shoes of the Japanese military, we would not be persuaded unless they used it against us directly.
Probably because Curtis LeMay's a military.
Well, the history is.
And this is a fascinating, right here, we're introducing.
You're supposed to get a discussion. Thank
Yeah,
you for
that's
bringing
great.
discussion.
That's right.
The Japanese military high command on August 7th, after the dropping of the first bomb, appealed to the emperor and said, we will arm every Japanese citizen. It will cost 25 million Japanese lives, but we will defend the homeland. That was their mindset.
Right.
That was their mindset.
Right.
And it took the emperor over his high command on August
Mississippi
12th.
Right.
Sorry.
That's okay, it's okay. It's
Yeah,
okay.
so I think a circus on that island would not work.
But nobody knows. It's unknowable. We didn't try it. I would say that the American experience was governed by the intensity of Japanese opposition in the island fighting. Every inch of territory was fiercely defended by the Japanese. They were heroic. They were extraordinary fighters. They gave their lives without blinking. Iwo Jima had happened, which was an unbelievably gruesome, awful set of battles. But this also had an influence on the American view, let's use this thing. And it was estimated by some people, again, how would they know, that if the US were to invade Japan, you forget about using the bomb, just invade Japan, all those islands, and MacArthur was leading the invasion, that the US would be ready around November 1st. So that's August, September, October, 3 months more, that it could cost 1 million American lives. Now, maybe he's off by an order of magnitude.
I don't think the number of the lives is an issue. Japanese had a uranium project that we destroyed during the Tokyo firebombs. And so the Oppenheimer suggestion of tell the emperor to tell the science committee that we're going to launch a bomb and you're going to see it. And the science people will say, well, shucks. I mean, we destroyed their uranium, so they had no way of producing it.
Yeah.
We knocked the top off the window. So they would have known.
But that doesn't mean they would have surrendered.
That's effectively trying to convince the military political powers of Tojo and his subordinates on not fighting. Which
You don't talk to Tojo, you talk to
Tojo is the last one in command besides the emperor.
Right. Well, these sorts of debates probably went on inside the government, yes. Yeah.
One of the other rationales not the demonstration. Also read that one of the other rationales not doing a demonstration was the fear that the bomb would work.
Yeah, right. I remember they only had 2. Didn't have a lot of flexibility here. Yes.
I recommended to watch this movie, The
Emperor.
Yeah.
About MacArthur.
Yes, MacArthur and the last moment of the Japanese Army High Command and the decision-making process between and how they deal with the United States at the last moment of the war.
Yeah. Because what actually happened was the bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. The Japanese leadership met. The military was totally opposed to surrendering, and nothing was done. There was no communication from Tokyo to Washington. Truman had already authorized the second bomb to be dropped. Kokura was cloud covered, so Nagasaki was an alternate target. And Kyoto was ruled out by Stimson. Hiroshima was bombed. Into my sheet here, 70,000 prompt fatalities, 170,000 total. You had lots of cancer incidents and other things that happened later. That was Little Boy, a gun-type device, the type that had never been tested, that wasn't tested out in Gordo, was just used at Hiroshima, and it worked as the scientists said it would. It was in the 13 to 18 kiloton range. Now, the second bomb, Japan hasn't responded yet. By the way, I met a man, I taught at Harvard years ago, and I met a man who was with MacArthur's team in the Pacific at this time. And he was among the first Americans to land on Japanese territory after the Japanese surrendered. And he described the scene and trying to get to Hiroshima. If you're driving along and suddenly come to mounds of earth and you can't get it, you can't find it. You can't actually get to what was the center of Hiroshima. It doesn't exist and it's blocked. Now, another issue that some historians have examined is a famous historian, Barton Bernstein at Stanford, who's examined microscopically the details of the decision-making process, that it's argued that the Japanese were not given enough time for them to assess what happened at Hiroshima. And had they had that time and then reported back to Tokyo, maybe they might have surrendered without the second bomb. So there's a community within the community that says, I can accept Hiroshima, but I can't accept Nagasaki. There's a school that says that one is enough. Nagasaki was the plutonium implosion device, Fat Man, 40,000 prompt fatalities, 80,000 dead, higher yield, 20 to 22 KT. That was August 9th, 1945. Then the emperor convenes a meeting. I believe he sort of went around the room, and not one of the military leaders endorsed surrender, not one. And the emperor said, I can't witness the destruction of my homeland. I can't do it. Because they had no idea whether Truman had 30 more of these things or 300 more. But he was pretty credible in what he did. So Hirohito overruled the military and ordered them to surrender, which the emperor is God. You don't counter him. So August 15th, I believe, they stipulated their surrender. And then they had the ceremony September 2nd on the battleship Missouri. That's the famous scene, battleship Missouri in Tokyo Harbor, where MacArthur is there and the Japanese sign the terms of surrender. And it was unconditional surrender, but then the Americans said the emperor can remain. Because there was already some, sensitivity to the fact about we're going to have a lot to do here in nation building, and let's not make it more difficult than it already is. Yes, question, comment?
Oh, no, sorry.
Just raising the finger. Okay. So, any more arguments about this? It's fine, it's all part of the learning class, yes.
Just have a question, how many kilograms of plutonium was that? Remember?
It was like,
I don't know, the plutonium one was on the order of 10, 20.
fat man was plutonium.
Small.
The other was 50 kilograms.
So, that led to the first and so far only use of nuclear weapons and the surrender of Japan and the end of the Second World War. Now, a few other things about the Maud Committee and so forth. As I mentioned bottom here, unknown to the US or to the British, the Soviets had an active espionage program at Los Alamos. And they had multiple dimensions to this espionage program. One was a very prominent British physicist named Klaus Fuchs, who was ultimately arrested for espionage and spent about 15 years in prison. But the most celebrated one were two Americans, a husband and wife team, the Rosenbergs, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. She didn't work at Los Alamos. There's a whole separate debate about if she was tried properly. Julius was there, he was an electrical engineer from City College in New York, but he wasn't involved in the heart of the bomb program. Ethel, his wife, had a brother, David Greenglass, who was involved in the design of the bomb that was being developed at Oak Ridge. And Julius asked Ethel if she could recruit her brother into the espionage program. Julius Rosenberg, by all accounts, and there's been a lot of archival work from the Soviet side as well, he was a committed communist. You have to understand, in the 30s and 40s, there were a lot of intellectuals who found Soviet communism very appealing. It meant egalitarianism. It meant, you know, today you're a janitor and I'm a physicist, tomorrow I'm a janitor, you're a physicist. There's no hierarchy. The imperfect aspects of capitalism disappeared. There are some wealthy people and some poor people. Now, of course, they had no idea what was going on in the Soviet Union. They didn't know that Stalin was executing a zillion people. It's alleged that he executed 20 million Soviet citizens in peacetime. That might have changed their minds. All they knew was the concept of Soviet communism, and they found that appealing. And Julius Rosenberg was definitely one of those. Ethel's role was just to type up the notes after the meetings at Julius's request. But they were both tried for espionage in 1950, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. And I have something here. The judge at the trial was probably a Jewish man named Kaufman, Irving Kaufman, Jewish name. And the judge said, this is now after 1950, Korean War had started in 1950. The Soviets had detonated an atomic bomb in 1949. We're now into the post-Cold War era, we're now into the Cold War. And here's what Kaufman said, speaking to Ethel and Julius Rosenberg. I consider your crime worse than murder. I believe your conduct in putting into the hands of the Russians the A-bomb, years before our best scientists predicted Russia would perfect the bomb, has already caused, in my opinion, the communist aggression in Korea, with the resultant casualties exceeding 50,000. And who knows but that millions more of innocent people may pay the price of your treason. Indeed, by your betrayal, you undoubtedly have altered the course of history to the disadvantage of our country. No one can say that we do not live in a constant state of tension. We have evidence of your treachery all around us every day, for the civilian defense activities throughout the nation are aimed at preparing us for an atom bomb attack. So this was a hugely controversial matter, whether they should be executed or not. There were many famous intellectuals and others who opposed the death penalty. I have some of their names here. I can't find them right at the moment. There are lots of different in-between features, but in any event, it was decided that they would be executed for treason. They are the only two Americans who've been executed for treason since World War II. We've had other spies. We've had all kinds of folks who worked for the Chinese and the Russians have been convicted. They're serving life in prison. But both Ethel and Julius Rosenberg were convicted and sentenced to be executed by electric chair. And ironically, a key element in their case was that Greenglass, Ethel's brother, who was recruited by Ethel to provide this information about the Oak Ridge device, because he cooperated, he was given a much milder sentence, about 15 years, and he lived to the age of 92. He only died a few years ago. So you can decide whether there's equity in this world. I've seen television programs not that long ago of the Rosenberg sons. They have two sons. Both of them are still trying to, uncover evidence that they weren't doing this or not. But my understanding is that the basic facts are now known, that Julius Rosenberg was a spy for the Soviet Union, and that Ethel's job was recruiting her brother and typing up the notes. Now, is that worth being executed? Sounds a little harsh to me. Yes?
Just now when you mentioned the Oak Ridge device, was Oak Ridge working on a separate bomb, like in parallel to Los Alamos, or were they contributing to?
No, they were contributing to the Los Alamos effort. This remains a very hot topic to this day. And also ethical, religious, other kinds of considerations here. But, you have to understand, I'm not justifying it, but I'm just trying to explain the timing of it. I mean, this is a time of intense anti-Soviet feeling in the United States. They had detonated a device which scared the hell out of the Americans. Kim Il-sung, the North Korean leader, the grandson of Kim Jong-un, was an avowed communist who bid in the Soviet Union. He started the Korean War. The Americans were fighting the Korean War and it wasn't going well. Americans were getting killed. It was only 5 years after the end of World War II. So, no, it's a pretty difficult time. Okay, so that, oh, I didn't talk about this NSA 47. I wanted to mention that. So eventually we're going to get into the policy process here. And an important feature of all this, the architecture for the policy process was established in 1947. Truman became convinced that the post-World War II world would be different than any world the US had before, possibly a protracted struggle with another major power. Remember, the Americans zip in and out. We don't tend to stay for very long. And that we were not well organized to deal with a protracted struggle like this. So legislation was passed in 1947 called the National Security Act. And the features of the National Security Act were, one, to change the name of the War Department to the Defense Department. The department was there to defend. That there would be a military reorganization so that there would now be a Joint Chiefs of Staff, which we didn't have before. The head of the Army, Navy, a new service, the Air Force, was established, since it was realized that aircraft were going to have an important role in delivering these weapons. And they already saw from what the Germans had done during the war, missiles would be a key weapon. And that one of these people, and the Marine Corps, one of these people would be the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. So there would be like a hierarchy of military leaders to make these decisions. That the US would establish a central intelligence agency, which we had never done before, as the premier intelligence gathering organization for the US government. Remember back in the late 20s, Stimson had said, gentlemen do not read other people's mail. So that was, Americans don't do this espionage stuff. We did do espionage actually during the Second World War, the Office of Strategic Services. But even after the war, we didn't have a central intelligence till the CIA. Today we have 16 different intelligence agencies, and it's now headed by, if you saw on TV yesterday, Dan Coates, who's the director of national intelligence. And he's his own staff of about 300 people. So there was the Defense Department, the Joint Chiefs, the CIA, and the Air Force was created as a separate service. And then within the Air Force, the Strategic Air Command was created as the service to be in charge of the delivery of nuclear weapons, SAC. And your friend Curtis LeMay was in charge, who had been involved in the bombing campaign in World War II. So, and of course we have all that today. We have the Defense Department, we have the CIA and 15 others, we have the Joint Chiefs, and we have the Air Force. And SAC has changed its name after the Cold War, the Strategic Command. To one little anecdote, I was in the Clinton administration when that happened and had an opportunity to visit SAC, which SAC is physically based at Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, near Omaha. And the head of SAC, this is long after LeMay had retired. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on his name, but he actually was an advocate to downgrade SAC and make it less significant because the Cold War was over. But that was not a popular opinion at SAC. And one of the memorable moments in my visit was an Air Force officer said to me, if you'd like, you can visit the PX. The PX is where you buy stuff.
Mhm.
And in the PX, they had a T-shirt. Oh, his name is Butler. That's right, General Butler. And the T-shirt said on the front of the T-shirt, "Who killed SAC?" And on the back it said, "The Butler did it." And you can talk about General Butler today at SAC, and this will not be a jolly conversation, because they lost the control of a lot of the authority to use these weapons. So anyway, that was that. Now, one final thing I thought I'd mention is what happened to Oppenheimer, which also some of you may know a lot about. So Oppenheimer was this amazing man, this guru, the man who put it all together and developed the atomic bomb in the Manhattan Project. He had had a very controversial background previously. Intellectually, he was world class, but he had a lot of left-wing friends, American Communist Party members. His wife was a member of the American Communist Party. When he was a professor here at Berkeley, there was a very famous, became famous French literature professor named Chevalier, who was a key figure in the American Communist Party. And people were saying, we're going to have this whole struggle now with the Soviets. Is this the kind of guy we want in charge of a lot of this stuff? So, what triggered, what brought this to a head was that there was a huge debate before 1949, and then definitely right after 1949 when the Soviets detonated, about whether the US should now move to a thermonuclear weapon, to an H-bomb. And Oppenheimer was unalterably opposed to the H-bomb. By this time, who emerged as a major proponent of the H-bomb was Edward Teller, Carl's colleague. And of course, once the atomic bomb was detonated by the Russians, the debate was pretty much over. The US was going to try to leapfrog ahead. This was very much an intense arms race with the Soviet Union. Then in 1954, it had gotten to the point where people were openly questioning what Oppenheimer's role ought to be on nuclear policy, given his communist, left-wing, whatever, leanings and his anti-H-bomb position. So there were a set of congressional hearings done in 1954, the Oppenheimer hearings. These are now world famous. There's books written about this and movies and so forth. And I have also a quote here. Okay, I think probably most of you know, but not all of you. The US has tiers of security clearances. We have secret, or confidential, secret, top secret. And we also have code word clearances for different fields. Like if you're a cyber person, you've got one letter. If you got nuclear weapons, it's Q. If you've got other things, it's something else. And then a sort of third dimension of security clearances. If you have access to information obtained from foreign sources, that's called SCI, Special Compartmented Information, SCI. So there's some people in this room who have TS, SCI, and Q clearances. And Oppenheimer was one of them. So one of the questions was, should Oppenheimer retain these clearances? And I have the language here. When Teller was asked this question, Teller was asked to testify against Oppenheimer. And he was shown a dossier of items unfavorable to Oppenheimer. Teller testified that he considered Oppenheimer loyal, but that, quote, in a great number of cases, I have seen Dr. Oppenheimer act, and I understand that Dr. Oppenheimer acted in a way which for me was, this is Teller now about Oppenheimer, in a way which for me was exceedingly hard to understand. I thoroughly disagreed with him in numerous issues, like the nuclear weapon. And his actions, frankly, appeared to me confused and complicated. To this extent, I feel that I would like to see the vital interests of this country in hands which I understand better and therefore trust more. Asked whether Oppenheimer should be granted security clearance, Teller said that, quote, if it is a question of wisdom or judgment, as demonstrated by actions since 1945, then I would say one would be wiser not to grant clearance. This is hugely controversial. This was New York Times headlines like this. And it led to Teller being ostracized in the scientific community. He wasn't ostracized at the lab, which he created, but the academics and people who had been his colleagues like Beta and others said they never talked to him again. They felt that because Teller was already very prestigious. He was a major figure in the design of the H-bomb. And this isn't just some other scientist's opinion. This is like a peer figure. So it says here, this led to outrage by many in the scientific community and Teller's ostracism and virtual expulsion from academic science. Now, I know there was a later moment where actually they met and Teller extended his hand to Oppenheimer, and Oppenheimer shook his hand. But Oppenheimer was devastated by this. He lost his clearances. He lost all access. He had no more advisory committees. Oppenheimer was a chain smoker, prolific chain smoker. At the age of 66, he got lung cancer and died. Teller lived into his 90s. So Oppenheimer is seen as a tragic figure. There's a phenomenal book, if you would like to read about Oppenheimer, called American Prometheus. Prometheus. It is a fantastic book. I know one of the co-authors, Marty Sherwin, who spent years writing the book, and then he got kind of writer's block, he couldn't finish it. And he teamed up with a journalist, Kai Bird, who was more fluent with the language, and they worked on it together and finished it. American Prometheus, in paperback, by Bird and Sherwin, or Sherwin and Bird. A lot of American nuclear policy is conveyed through this book. It's not a thin book. It's about 600-700 pages, but it is a phenomenal book. Sorry? Very good audio book. So anyway, I just wanted to convey that. So that was in 1954. The Rosenberg execution was in 1953. And by this time now, we're really into the heart of the Cold War. So from my side of the policy perspective, my next sessions with you get into what Kaplan has to say and the US-Soviet nuclear arms competition. Yeah. If you want to come in. No?
I just want to point on slide one of my regrets. There's an enormous literature. I'm not a bit of a junkie history, full of the history of Manhattan. For so much of it is about Berkeley and our faculty. those of you who saw the movie, The Last Day After Trinity, you see a lot of Frank Oppenheimer, and his brother, who unquestionably was communist. I actually met him. He was the founder of the Exploratorium.
Right.
Here in San Francisco. I met him in 1980 at a coffee shop. He was a very simple man. Partially my own interest in the whole history, it's a very complex history of the bomb project, is that my father was a pilot in the Army in the Pacific Theater, and it was a very awful time. They went to the beginning of the Battle of the Leyte Gulf and was scheduled to go into Japan. I think he did not have a lot of qualms about being sent off early from that thing. The thing that's interesting about this history is that there are layers and layers of complexity which will never be unraveled properly, and I think legitimate people can opine on it. The one that I rankle about and is the scapegoating of Edward Teller, who these were all men that were complex, vain, brilliant men. And everyone sort of imputes the pulling of the security clearance to Oppenheimer to Teller. That was not entirely it. And the thing that I would like to point out in as a counterpoint was, and again, this came out very clearly when you saw the documentary, in the middle of the war, Oppenheimer made this incredible confabulation about the role of Conrad Chevalier. We're in an innocent conversation where you turn to Berkeley saying, by the way, I was approached by these people who asked questions about it. And then later on, the story got so inverted to make Conrad Chevalier look like he was the center of a ring. This kind of thing. So now fast forward 50 some odd years, a very good personal friend of mine who Michael knows as well, by E. Michael Campbell, who was the first director of the NIF project, brilliant laser plasma physicist. He was the heir apparent to the next lab director. One day, he gets a phone call from the president of the University of California. He says, I'm giving you 2 hours to give a complete explanation. There's all of a sudden one day, fax machines around the country started exploding, saying, Mike Campbell does not have a PhD. Right. Every year, 5 years, he did his reinvestigation report on the retained SQ clearance. He was listed as being Dr. E. Michael Campbell. He said, well, my secretary filled out that information for me. But basically, he was badged, pinched, and he was marched off the site and was denied clearance for 15 years. Now he's at the University of Rochester, has his clearance time. The United States has had a very consistent policy that when you fill out the paperwork to get your clearance, you have to tell the absolute truth. And a lot of it about your personal background, they have to be right, as you can remember. But any little confabulation like that will cost you. And
like Jared Kushner.
Oh, sorry. So in one sense, you can say, well, Oppenheimer, I mean, the same standards are being levied. Yet in one case, you have a convenient scapegoat.
Yeah, I hear your point, and I respect that. You shouldn't lie to the government with nuclear secrets, but Oppenheimer was tried in a kangaroo court, number one. Number two, Edward Teller's scapegoating as the person who lost his clearance might be accepted publicly, but is not true. I mean, you read the book, and I didn't know Teller, I'm too young for that, but I do know that Edward Teller was essentially used by a very small man in the Napoleon complex named Louis Strauss.
Yeah.
And so if Teller could be manipulated by some jerk economist from the Institute of Advanced Study, with no technical background, then I would argue that maybe his judgment shouldn't be used as fodder for removing the clearance of someone.
One could impugn his right. And by the way, they were not at that point personal friends. Teller was furious that Oppenheimer had tried to block the project.
Right.
But you're right. I mean, if you look at the words that Michael said there, in view of his decisions and his way of thinking after the war, that's not an adequate judgment for pulling clearance.
Aside on the Teller thing, they wanted to fire Teller at the United because he was the troublemaker, or he didn't do his work. It was Oppenheimer's strange judgment that allowed Teller to develop the initial thermonuclear device. So saying that, saying that it's just cloud, the story that, making yourself the poison of
Who tell it? Oh, Oppenheimer. Yeah.
From a militaristic standpoint, the military force is always a pain because you are.
No, this Lewis Strauss post is super angry.
But when you have affiliations with known foreign nationals, foreign entities who are now identity, anybody here can tell you that you will lose your clearance if you have foreign nationals.
So
All
Oppenheimer was still be following what the computer was but like that's
But like, one thing that comes out, or comes up, and I think everybody would agree, the unsung brilliant guy who goes to the Broadway was Leslie Rose. Everyone said, well, this is kind of this low-brow military guy. He was the guy who basically intuited Oppenheimer was the guy. And he said, look, if we're going to move fast, we're going to have to decompartmentalize again. There are no barriers, no walls inside. I understand the risk that there will be espionage. It's a calculated risk, and it worked. You know, and he was a very smart guy. He wrote his own book called Now It Can Be Told.
Yeah.
Well, there's so much emotional relief in that.
Sure.
Right.
I want just a couple of additional points with that. With the meeting. So I mentioned here, Kurchatov, a very eminent Soviet physicist, was the head of the Soviet bomb program. And he was given a copy of the Mord report in 1943. I can't recall the source, but at one point, Lavrenti Beria, who was the head of the KGB, the NKVD, Kurchatov said to Beria, we have so much information on the Manhattan bomb project. We can't process anymore. Stop sending us information. So they had multiple sources to this, of which the Rosenbergs and Klaus Fuchs were only two. And some have been identified, but some have not been. The Soviets are superb at espionage. Finally, I want to make one point about the German program. Remember, as Paul mentioned last time, it was Strassman and who had understood about the splitting of the uranium atom being bombarded by Nixon. So Hitler did start a bomb program of his own, and the initial impetus for the Manhattan Project was racing against the Germans. They hoped the Germans would beat the U.S. for the bomb. There's a very curious incident that happened in 1941. Yes, October 41. The head of the German bomb program was Wolfgang Heisenberg. You know, he was the War Heisenberg paid a visit to Niels Bohr, who was his professor. Bohr was in Denmark, he was dating. Denmark was occupied by the Nazis, by the Germans. It's never been crystal clear what happened with that discussion. Later on, a play was written called Copenhagen, which presents alternative scenarios. Did Heisenberg go to Bohr because he wanted additional technical insight into how to build a bomb? Did Heisenberg go to Bohr to assure him that as long as Heisenberg was in charge, he'd keep the Germans astray and they'd never build a bomb? What was the rationale for Heisenberg's visit to board? Ironically, the former instructor in this class, Stan Houston, visited Copenhagen, and before he got sick and passed away, and told me that there were tons of private papers in board offices that had never been seen by anybody. And Stan was determined to get over there one summer and fought through this. I think he actually knew German. His wife was killed. His wife is killed. And see if we could figure out the answer to that question. But unfortunately, cancer progressed and he passed away before. So we do know, I think, that there's some other anecdotes that Heisenberg thought the amount of fissile material required for the bomb was much, much greater than was actually the case. Although there again, there's a counter question, was he exaggerating purposefully to keep the Germans off the mark on them? We do know they never had a bomb, thank goodness. Or Sanders didn't figure to take this course. Yes. Yes.
Redwater is also partially neutron filtered. So neutron filtering on top of that. Heavy water is a part of that.
So it requires a lot of space to do that, so that you- I have to do some-
It wasn't top priority. But Hitler was very creative, willing to support other programs, the B1, the B2, state-of-the-art stuff. He wasn't a kind of stick in the mud on this stuff. He made many bold decisions, some of which were wrong. Also, the Japanese had no major program. And, something they could have discussed with the Germans. The Russians were all over the Japanese. The Russians had a major espionage penetration of the Japanese. Yeah. There's something called the Red Orchestra. It's a famous book about Soviet espionage of Japan. Uh-huh.
I'll put a very interesting short history paper up on that. There was a fellow in this class last year by the name of Jonathan, he was a brilliant student in the history department. He's in Japan, he's in the German places. It's sort of post-war reaction to German nuclear program. But I was on his qualifying exam. There's a history professor, and he died several years ago, Thomas Smith, who was GI. He knew Japanese, and was sent as a translator in the post-war reconstruction of Japan. They didn't have anything to do, so this many officers just let them take a jeep and go out together, look at towns and so forth. And then one day, because of his knowledge of the city, these guys from the Navy commander came up and he said, we have authorization from Washington to go to, and to get in his name now, the head of the nuclear lab in Kyoto, to assist these people to go there, cut the cyclotron up and dump it in the ocean. And he actually describes going there and, and he said it was very sad because he actually got to know the professor very well. He had to go there, he had to translate the story to the professor from these professor psychopaths, which was just used for basic research. And actually, there were 5 cyclotrons after this kind of across the can was cut off by the Americans after the one bumped the ocean. Apparently, it was starting to drop it to the deep part of the ocean. Down the ocean, like it wasn't necessary. But it's a charming little piece, and he said at that time he went back and decided to do a big professor. So I'll put that up on the record.
For your book, it's the red orchestra. Red orchestra actually goes to the internal Nazi resistance party.
Really good, thank you. Got a lot of good corrections. Okay, so that's, I think next time, Professor Van Bibble will speak on technical materials.
Also, please go on B courses and follow the link to take the poll on discussion section times. Like I said, we won't be having a discussion section this week because we're figuring that out. It's clear already from the results we won't be able to accommodate everyone, but we'll figure something out, like maybe recording the discussion sections and whatnot to accommodate those who can't be there. So.
Thanks for your contribution. Appreciate it.